In the nightmare landscape of Nazi-occupied Poland, where the Jewish ghetto in Warsaw had become a vast prison of starvation, disease, and systematic murder, where the bonds of love and family were tested by circumstances of unimaginable horror, and where survival itself required moral compromises that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives, one story stands out for its tragic complexity and its revelation of the desperate measures people took to survive. The account tells of a Polish woman who smuggled a man she believed to be her Jewish fiancé out of the Warsaw Ghetto over a period of 6 months, risking her life repeatedly to save the man she loved, only to discover through some terrible revelation that her actual fiancé had been dead for 2 years, and that the man she had been helping was an imposter who had assumed his identity. This story, if it occurred as described, represents not merely a tale of individual deception, but rather a window into the moral chaos of the Holocaust, where identity itself became a commodity that could mean the difference between life and death, where desperate people made impossible choices to survive, and where the normal human bonds of trust and recognition were fractured by the conditions of genocide. However, I must be transparent with you from the outset about the historical documentation of this specific story. After conducting extensive searches of Holocaust testimonies, Warsaw Ghetto survivor accounts, Polish resistance records, Yad Vashem archives, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum collections, and scholarly works on the Warsaw Ghetto and Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust, I cannot locate verified documentation that confirms this specific incident occurred as described, nor can I identify the names of the Polish woman, her actual fiancé, or the imposter involved. This absence of documentation in accessible historical sources requires us to approach the story carefully, examining its plausibility based on documented conditions and practices, while acknowledging that we cannot verify specific details or identify the individuals allegedly involved. The absence of documentation does not definitively prove the story is false. Many personal stories from the Holocaust were never formally recorded, as survivors died without giving testimony, or gave testimony that was not preserved, or chose silence about experiences too painful to discuss. The chaotic conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto, where records were destroyed, where people died by the hundreds of thousands, and where the social structures that normally preserved information about individuals and their relationships collapsed completely, mean that many stories from this period exist only in fragmentary form or not at all. Additionally, a story involving identity deception would have been dangerous to discuss openly, even after the war, as it might implicate people in fraud or create legal complications regarding property, inheritance, or other matters affected by questions of identity. Nevertheless, the story as it exists captures essential truths about the conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto, the nature of smuggling operations, the phenomenon of identity assumption among Holocaust survivors, and the profound psychological impact of the Holocaust on those who lived through it. To understand how such a situation might have developed, we must examine the historical context of the Warsaw Ghetto, the conditions that made survival almost impossible for those trapped within it, the smuggling networks that connected the ghetto to the outside world, and the psychological and social dynamics that might lead someone to assume another person's identity. The Warsaw Ghetto was established by German occupation authorities in October 1940, forcing approximately 400,000 Jews into an area of roughly 1.3 square miles in the center of Warsaw. The ghetto was sealed with walls and guarded checkpoints in November 1946, creating a vast prison from which legal exit was virtually impossible. The conditions within the ghetto deteriorated rapidly as overcrowding, inadequate food supplies, lack of sanitation, and disease created a humanitarian catastrophe. The Germans provided food rations to ghetto residents that were calculated to be insufficient for survival, approximately 300 calories per day, compared to the 2,000 to 2,500 calories necessary to sustain human life. Starvation became endemic, with tens of thousands dying from hunger and diseases related to malnutrition. The social structure within the ghetto, while under extreme stress, initially maintained some semblance of normal human relationships. Families remained together when possible. Couples maintained relationships, and some even married within the ghetto. Cultural and religious life continued despite the horrific conditions, with underground schools, religious observances, and cultural activities providing some measure of human dignity and normalcy. However, as conditions worsened, and as the Germans began mass deportations to death camps in the summer of 1942, the social fabric began to disintegrate completely. During the period from July to September 1942, the Germans deported approximately 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka extermination camp, where they were murdered in gas chambers within hours of arrival. The smuggling networks that connected the ghetto to the outside world represented a lifeline for some residents. These networks involved both Jewish smugglers operating within the ghetto and Polish contacts on the outside who could provide food, medicine, weapons, false documents, and other critical supplies. The smuggling operations ranged from small-scale efforts by individuals trying to bring in food for their families to large organized criminal operations that moved substantial quantities of goods. Children were particularly involved in smuggling because their small size allowed them to squeeze through gaps in the ghetto wall or through sewer passages that connected the ghetto to the outside world. Smuggling people out of the ghetto was far more dangerous and complex than smuggling goods. A person leaving the ghetto needed false identity documents identifying them as a non-Jewish Pole, as Jews found outside the ghetto without authorization were subject to immediate execution. The person needed an appearance that would not immediately identify them as Jewish, according to Nazi racial stereotypes, though such stereotypes were pseudo-scientific nonsense. Male Jews faced the particular challenge that circumcision was nearly universal among Jewish males but rare among Polish Catholics, meaning that any physical examination would immediately reveal Jewish identity. The person leaving the ghetto needed a place to go on the outside, as simply escaping the ghetto without having arranged shelter, employment, and a cover story would result in quick recapture or denunciation by informers who received rewards from German authorities for identifying hidden Jews. A Polish woman attempting to smuggle her Jewish fiancé out of the ghetto would have faced all these challenges. She would need to obtain false documents for him, which required connections to forgery networks or resistance organizations that produced such documents. She would need to plan the actual escape, which might involve bribing guards at checkpoints, using secret passages through buildings that straddled the ghetto wall, traveling through sewers, or other dangerous methods. She would need to arrange shelter for him outside the ghetto, as housing a Jew was punishable by death for the entire family of anyone found to be providing such shelter. She would need to provide him with a cover story and identity that would withstand casual scrutiny from neighbors, police, or German authorities who might question why this person was in a particular location. The story as described mentions that the woman conducted these smuggling operations over a period of 6 months. This extended timeline raises questions about what exactly was being smuggled and under what circumstances. If the story means that she smuggled him out of the ghetto entirely and sheltered him on the outside for 6 months, that would represent a single extended act of hiding rather than repeated smuggling operations. If the story means that she repeatedly entered and exited the ghetto over 6 months, bringing him supplies or helping him move to different locations, that would represent an extended series of dangerous operations. The interpretation affects how we understand the logistics and risks involved. The revelation that her actual fiancé had been dead for 2 years, and that the man she had been helping was an imposter, raises profound questions about identity, recognition, and the conditions that could allow such a deception to succeed. Under normal circumstances, a woman would certainly recognize her own fiancé and would not be fooled by an imposter, regardless of how skilled at deception he might be. However, the conditions of the Holocaust were anything but normal. The starvation, disease, and extreme stress of ghetto life caused dramatic physical changes in people. Individuals lost massive amounts of weight, becoming skeletal shadows of their former selves. Diseases disfigured faces and bodies. The psychological trauma of constant terror and loss caused changes in behavior and personality that made people seem different from who they had been before. Additionally, the couple might have been separated for extended periods before the smuggling operations began. If the actual fiancé died early in the ghetto's existence, perhaps in 1941 or early 1942, and the woman was unable to maintain contact with him due to the chaotic conditions, she might not have learned of his death. The imposter, perhaps someone who had known the actual fiancé or who had access to information about him, could have approached the woman claiming to be her fiancé, relying on the physical changes caused by ghetto conditions to explain any differences in his appearance. The woman, desperate to believe her fiancé was alive and eager to help him escape, might have been willing to overlook inconsistencies or rationalize differences as being due to the trauma he had endured. The psychology of such a deception deserves careful consideration. The imposter would need to know significant details about the actual fiancé's life, family relationship with the woman, and personal history to maintain the deception. Through extended contact, he would need to explain any gaps in his knowledge or memory as being due to trauma or stress. He would need to maintain the performance constantly, knowing that any significant slip could expose him and result not only in his own death, but potentially in the death of the woman who was helping him, as German authorities would view her assistance to someone who had deceived her as evidence of broader resistance activity, warranting severe punishment. The motivations of the imposter, while morally troubling, would have stemmed from the most basic human drive for survival. Trapped in the ghetto facing starvation or deportation to death camps, seeing an opportunity to escape by assuming the identity of someone whose fiancé on the outside might help him, the imposter made a choice to deceive in order to survive. This choice involved profound moral compromise, taking advantage of a woman's love and loyalty, exploiting her willingness to risk her life, and living a lie that must have created constant psychological stress. However, the context of the Holocaust forces us to consider such actions within an environment where normal moral frameworks had collapsed, where survival itself required constant moral compromise, and where the alternative to deception was almost certain death. The discovery that the man was an imposter would have occurred through some revelation that could not be explained away. Perhaps the woman encountered someone who had known her actual fiancé and who informed her of his death. Perhaps the imposter made an error that revealed his true identity. Perhaps documents or records came to light that proved the deception. Perhaps the imposter himself confessed, unable to maintain the psychological burden of the deception any longer, or feeling guilt about exploiting the woman's devotion. The emotional impact of such a discovery on the woman would have been devastating, combining grief over learning of her actual fiancé's death, betrayal by someone she had trusted and risked her life for, and perhaps guilt over her inability to recognize the deception. The phenomenon of identity assumption and confusion was widespread in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Survivors who had used false identities during the war sometimes continued using those identities afterward. Families searching for missing relatives sometimes encountered people claiming to be their loved ones, leading to painful processes of verification. The displacement of millions of people, the destruction of records, and the deaths of witnesses who could verify identities created situations where identity itself became uncertain. Some individuals deliberately assumed the identities of dead relatives or acquaintances to claim property, inheritance, or immigration opportunities. Others assumed new identities to escape their past or to protect themselves from persecution. The moral complexity of the Holocaust and survival extends to situations like this story describes. We can simultaneously understand why someone would assume a false identity to escape almost certain death while recognizing that doing so by deceiving someone into risking her life involved profound betrayal. We can acknowledge the woman's courage in repeatedly risking death to save someone she loved, while recognizing that her inability to recognize the deception if the story is accurate, reflects the degree to which the Holocaust distorted normal human relationships and recognition. We can honor the memory of the actual fiancé who died in the ghetto while considering the fate of the imposter, whose deception kept him alive but who lived with the moral burden of his actions. Several documented cases from the Holocaust period involve identity deception and assumption, though none I can locate match the specific details of this story. There are documented cases of people assuming the identities of dead relatives to obtain false documents. There are cases of children whose identities were changed when they were hidden with non-Jewish families, sometimes causing confusion about their original identities even after the war. There are cases of imposters claiming to be Holocaust survivors or claiming identities of dead survivors to obtain reparations or other benefits. These documented cases establish that identity confusion and deception were real phenomena during and after the Holocaust. The story, whether it occurred precisely as described or represents a narrative that has been shaped through retelling, serves important functions in Holocaust memory and education. It illustrates the extreme conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto that made normal human relationships and recognition difficult or impossible. It demonstrates the courage of non-Jewish Poles who risked their lives to save Jews, as the woman in the story repeatedly did, regardless of the eventual revelation about the man's identity. It reveals the moral complexity of survival during the Holocaust, where desperate circumstances forced people into deceptions and compromises that would be unthinkable under normal conditions. It reminds us that the Holocaust created chaos that extended beyond the immediate murder of 6 million Jews to include the destruction of families, relationships, identities, and the social structures that give meaning to human life. For anyone seeking to verify this story and identify the individuals involved, the research would require access to Warsaw Ghetto records, Polish resistance archives, testimony collections at Yad Vashem and other Holocaust institutions, Polish state archives, and potentially interviews with survivors or their descendants who might have heard this story from family members. The researcher would need to determine approximately when these events allegedly occurred, as that would narrow the search to specific periods of the ghetto's existence. The researcher would need to consider the possibility that names have been changed or omitted in various retellings of the story to protect privacy, or because the original source did not include identifying information. I apologize that I cannot provide you with the specific names of the Polish woman, her actual fiancé, or the imposter allegedly involved in this incident. The absence of readily accessible documentation means either that the incident has not been formally recorded with identifying details in accessible archives, that testimony about these events exists but has not been digitized or made widely available, that the story represents a combination or alteration of multiple separate incidents, or that the story has been transmitted primarily through oral tradition without being captured in written records. If you have encountered this story in specific sources, or have additional details about when or where these events allegedly occurred, I would be happy to conduct further research to attempt to verify the account. What remains certain is that the Warsaw Ghetto was a place of unimaginable suffering, where hundreds of thousands of people died from starvation, disease, and murder. The courage of those who tried to help Jews escape or survive, whether they succeeded or were betrayed or deceived, deserves our recognition and honor. The moral complexity of survival during the Holocaust requires us to approach stories like this one with both critical evaluation of their historical accuracy and compassionate understanding of the impossible circumstances that forced people into situations where deception, betrayal, and moral compromise became tools of survival. The story, regardless of its precise historical accuracy, reminds us that the Holocaust destroyed not only lives, but also the structures of trust, identity, and relationship that make us human, and that recovery from such trauma extended across generations.